Start recording. Welcome to week 9 of Rethinking Capitalism. Actually, as you probably already know, we're changing our order a bit. I'm going to do the week 10 material on ecological economics before touching on what was planned for week 9, which was supposed to be about privatization in something called the game of mates. This is basically because, for selfish reasons, I have to admit, life has just become so ridiculously busy for reasons related to economics, but not directly related to teaching at the University of Adelaide, that I'm just going to have to do the best I can for the rest of the semester. And from the end of this year, I'm going part-time at the uni because I can't cope with a full-time uni job and everything else any more, although I hope that I'll still be teaching Rethinking Capitalism to another group of students next year. But there are some things that I'm not going to be doing anymore at the uni because I'm just getting to the point where I can't cope with it. First of all, about your essays, they were absolutely terrific, as I have said on social media. They range from the amazingly terrific to the extraordinarily amazingly terrific. I don't necessarily look forward to reading about 60 essays all on the same title, because they can get a bit samey normally after a while, but that wasn't the case with this assignment. There was a huge variety of approaches that you took to responding to economic possibilities for our grandchildren. I'm very grateful for that. I enjoyed reading them. I didn't read them all at the same time because I wanted to have plenty of energy and enthusiasm to read each new one. I've given you all some feedback. It's only my opinion, and I, in many cases, have had to be hypercritical to have anything even vaguely negative to say at all. You all got a good mark. I couldn't give you all exactly the same mark, so I had to, albeit some of this was obviously subjective, but I had to find some way of giving some of you slightly higher marks than others. I've done the best that I could with that, but it was absolutely terrific. Thank you very much for the work you put in on that first assignment, which a little bit relates to what we're going to be talking about this week. The topic for this week, promoted from week 10 to week 9, is ecological economics. And actually, maybe I should have started with this or done it much earlier in the course. I'm glad to say that in many of your cases, you touched on material that we're going to talk about this week in your essays. And I can't claim to be much more of an expert in this area than a lot of you are, really. We're a long way away from what I've made my living doing over the last 35 years. I've taught some macroeconomics, and I've done plenty of banking and finance training, taught international finance for years, done a little bit of things like international trade sometimes, but I'm not, certainly not an ecological economist. I'm not an earth systems scientist or a climate scientist or anything like that. I'm not used to talking about this topic. So we'll do the best that we can, but as has often been the case on this course, you're a little bit guinea pigs, really, in that I'm sure if I dealt with this topic 4 or 5 times instead of just the first time under a lot of time pressure, I'd probably do it more effectively. But we're going to do the best that we can. I'm going to draw some things to your attention, and I really think this is the most important topic. It does link into everything else. Kate Raworth and Stephanie Kelton and Mariana Mazzucato go together in my mind when I'm thinking about an economics for the 21st century. You don't have to agree with me, but that's my my view of the world. And I hope that I've made some of you start to have some thoughts that you didn't have a few months ago as we've gone through the course, or at least re-examine your view of the world somewhat. And I guess what I'd be hoping for from this week's material, which because I'm not rushing, might even take part of next week as well, is I want to make some of you panic. I want to shake people, and this is one reason for going part-time, so that I can develop some more expertise in this area, and I can be part of a movement for change in Australia and around the world. I want to shake us out of our complacency a little bit, where not just climate change, but the human impact on our ecosystem and the potential impact this might have, not just on future generations, but on your generation, maybe even on some of mine, depending on how long people like me actually live, are concerned. I don't want to be negative about this because I believe, and this is what climate scientists and engineers tell us, that within the laws of nature and within our technological possibilities, we can build a sustainable and just future economy, local, national economy, global economy. It's not beyond our abilities to do this, but I also believe that we don't have very much time. We have only a very short amount of time if we are going to avoid the worst possible consequences of climate change, decreasing biodiversity, species loss, and all the other things that someone like Joanne Rockstrom or Kate Raworth might talk about when they talk about sustainability. And really, it's going to be down to your generation and the generation that follows you to meet this challenge. And as you know, I think that neoclassical economics has had its uses. Apart from just giving me something to teach for much of the last 35 years, it's had its uses down through the decades. But it has its limitations. And I think the greatest limitations with neoclassical economics and the greatest, what's the word? The greatest danger from the complacency which a neoclassical frame tends to give people when thinking about economic management and everything that goes along with it, relates to our ecology and particularly our climate system. All right, having said that then, let's share something just for a moment. We'll start off with this, but just the first couple of slides. I'm not going to hurry, and we'll just see how we go. So you can see the slides now. Of course, it says week 10, it's actually week 9, because I haven't written the week 9 material yet. Ecological economics is becoming more and more high profile as time goes by. In the first edition of the book Contending Perspectives in Economics by my friend John Harvey, there was no separate chapter on ecological economics. There is in the second edition, which is featured there, and quite rightly so, for reasons that we're going to talk about. As I've already mentioned, by no means our only ecological challenge, but the most urgent one is the threat of climate change. Climate change is seen as the most important issue of our time by most scientists. That figure of 97% doesn't actually relate to climate change being the most important issue of our time. That's the figure which is usually given for the proportion of professional scientists who, first of all, believe that the climate is changing in a particular direction, that there are trends to be concerned about, and secondly, that this is the result of human activity. Up until relatively recently, the economics profession, almost without exception, almost entirely ignored climate change. When I say relatively recently, you can, at the millennium, this would have been true. Not all economists have ignored climate change. Those who engage with climate change are divided between environmental economists who see it as a microeconomic issue and address it within the frame of neoclassical economics, and ecological economists who don't see it as a purely microeconomic resource allocation issue and don't see it as and don't address it within the frame of neoclassical economics, but instead are drawn from what we up until now have called heterodox economics. Now, rather than go on with these slides for the moment, I thought what I would do is this going to work? Is I would take one of the documents which I've shared with you as an announcement on our site today. Actually, Steve Keen's work on this area I've highlighted to you before, but I've just chosen this short conversation article because we can read through it. Steve is a heterodox economist. Down through the decades, he would have called himself a post-Keynesian or Minskian economist. He's very recently joined the MMT camp, I think it's fair to say. Steve is an ecological economist as well. And he's discussing work by, well, particularly by William Nordhaus, who for 50 years has been a neoclassical economist, famous neoclassical economist, and is an environmental economist, basically, and indeed got a Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for his work in environmental economics relating to climate change. Nordhaus believes that you can forecast the costs and benefits of various scenarios for the climate stretching out into the indefinite future. And by doing that, you can identify an optimal amount of global warming that you could allow to take place. And then you can design a policy response which might involve a very low level of carbon tax, perhaps, in order to steer the economy down that optimal path. For a variety of reasons, people like Steve Keen and me think that William Nordhaus and the Nobel Prize that he was awarded are dangerous to, well, in a variety of ways. That's no disrespect to his intelligence. Of course, he's a very brilliant man, but we believe that he's working within a misleading frame, that many of the things he takes for granted are not only not true, but also potentially catastrophically misleading. So let's just have a look at some of the words, because this is a very short article of Steve Keen. I'm going to read this with you. While climate scientists warn that climate change could be catastrophic, economists such as 2018 Nobel Prize winner William Nordhaus asserts that it will be nowhere near as damaging. In a 2018 paper published after he was awarded the prize, and you know how influential the Nobel Prize is, Nordhaus claimed that 3 degrees Celsius of warming would reduce global GDP by just 2.1% compared to what it would be in the total absence of climate change. Personally, if it's down to me, I wouldn't be talking about GDP at all in the context of avoiding potentially catastrophic climate change. But of course, Nordhaus doesn't expect any catastrophe. Even a 6 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature, he claimed, would reduce GDP by just 8.5%. Earth system scientists I respect would claim that a 6 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature will effectively end our civilization. So we obviously have a significantly different view. If you find reassurance in those mild estimates of damage, be warned. In a newly published paper, which I think I shared with you, I demonstrated that the data on which these estimates are based relies on seriously flawed assumptions. Nordhaus's celebrated work, which according to the Nobel Committee has brought us considerably closer to answering the question of how we can achieve sustained and sustainable global economic growth, gives governments a reason to give climate change a low priority. And in Australia, climate change has a seriously low priority. And when I say it has a low priority, it shouldn't do. We are, as everybody should know by now, amongst high-income countries anyway, very, very highly exposed to the risk of climate change, including sitting where I am at the moment in the Adelaide Hills. His estimates imply that the costs of addressing climate change exceed the benefits until global warming reaches 4 degrees Celsius. Well, Stefan will tell you the world might support perhaps 1 billion people if we had that degree of global warming. So there's obviously a huge difference in views here. And then a mild carbon tax will be sufficient to stabilise temperatures at this level at an overall cost of less than 4% of GDP in 120 years' time. Unfortunately, these numbers are based on empirical estimates that are not merely wrong, but irrelevant, and in my view, bonkers. Nordhaus and about 20 like-minded economists use two main methods to derive sanguine estimates of the economic consequences of climate change, the so-called enumerative method and the statistical method. But my research shows neither stand up to scrutiny. The enumerative method. In the enumerative method, to quote neoclassical climate change economist Richard Tull, estimates of the physical effects of climate change are obtained one by one from natural science papers and added up. This sounds reasonable until you realise that the way this method has been deployed ignores industries that account for 87% of GDP on the assumption they're undertaken in carefully controlled environments that will not be directly affected by climate change. Well, good luck doing your manufacturing in that factory after it's burned down. But anyway, Nordhaus's list of industries that he assumed would be unaffected includes all manufacturing, underground mining, transportation, communication, finance, insurance, non-coastal real estate. I live in non-coastal real estate, right in the middle of a fire zone, retail and wholesale trade, and government services. It is everything that is not directly exposed to the elements. Effectively, everything that happens indoors or underground. 2 decades after Nordhaus made this assumption, in 1991, the economics section of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report repeated it. Economic activities such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and mining are exposed to the weather and thus vulnerable to climate change. Other economic activities, such as manufacturing and services, largely take place in controlled environments and are not really exposed to climate change. Utter nonsense. This is mistaking the weather for the climate. Climate change will affect all industries. It could turn fertile regions into deserts, force farms and the cities they support to move faster than topsoil can develop, create storms that can blow down those carefully controlled environments, and firestorms that burn them to the ground. It could force us to eliminate the use of fossil fuels before we have sufficient renewable energy in place. The output of those carefully controlled environments will fall in concert with a decline in available energy. The assumption that anything done indoors will be unaffected by climate change is absurd. Let me repeat my description: bonkers. And if this is wrong, then so are the conclusions based upon it. The same applies, and I think even more seriously, to the statistical method. As I explained in a previous article, this method assumes that the relationship between temperature and GDP today could be used to predict what will happen as the whole planet's climate changes. So, you know, the idea, Spain is a bit warmer than Britain. What impact does the increase in temperature between Britain and Spain have on GDP? Absolutely absurd to think that's got anything to do with global warming. But while temperature isn't a particularly important factor in economic output today, climate change will do much more than simply raise individual countries' temperature by a few degrees. The disruption it will cause is enormous. You can see the kind of debate between somebody called Daniel Swain here, who is not someone that I'm familiar with, who's making a very sensible point, and Richard Tull, who is a neoclassical economist, who on this point, again, I'm going to say it again, I think is just bonkers. Nonetheless, these optimistic estimates were used to calibrate Nordhaus's so-called damage function, a simple equation that predicts a small and smooth fall in GDP from a given rise in temperature. but climate change will not be a smooth process. There will be tipping points, as we're going to talk about at some point in the next 3 lectures or so, if not the next 2 lectures. Nordhaus justified using a smooth equation by incorrectly claiming that climate scientists, including Tim Lenton from the University of Exeter, had concluded that there were no critical tipping points with a time horizon of less than 300 years unless global temperatures have increased by at least 3 degrees Celsius. In fact, Lenton and his colleagues identified Arctic summer sea ice as a critical tipping point that was likely to be triggered in the next decade or 2 by changes of between 0.5 degrees Celsius and 2 Celsius. And actually, there are more tipping points than that, which Earth system scientists have identified, which may have been, in some cases, triggered already, as we're going to see. We conclude that the greatest and clearest threat, this is from Lenton and his colleagues, is to the Arctic, with summer sea ice loss likely to occur long before and potentially contributes to Greenland ice sheet melt. And you know what happens when there's less ice, less of the heat coming into our atmosphere is reflected back out of our atmosphere again. So it adds to global warming, the less ice that there is in order to do this. The reason these mistakes are so significant is that despite the flawed assumptions on which it is based, this work has been taken seriously by politicians, as Nordhaus's Nobel Prize recognizes. If you are in a political party, whether it is the Liberal Party or the National Party or the Labour Party or the Greens or whatever other party you might be in, then you should be telling this to the people that represent you. If you are not in a political party, you might join a political party or a protest movement. I don't care which party. There's no partisanship here. This is not a left-right issue. This is about science. To these policymakers, a prediction of future levels of GDP is far easier to understand than unfamiliar concepts like the viability of our ecosystem. They have been misled by comforting numbers that bear no relation to what climate change will, in fact, do to our economies. Now, let me go back to those slides. Environmental and ecological economics, Nordhaus, an environmental economist, Steve Keen, an ecological economist, like my good friend Philip Lawn, who some of you have been taught by in the past. If you are an environmental economist, Nicholas Stern, who I once had a very interesting conversation with in his office many years ago, behind the UK Stern Review, from, well, what is it now? Must be nearly 15 years ago. He's a neoclassical economist, so he comes at things from the environmental economics angle, like Nordhaus does, but in my view, does a much better job than Nordhaus, and was much more alarming in the Stern Review than Nordhaus has been in any of his published research. Environmental economics, as you know, is an offshoot of neoclassical economics. It's about the microeconomics of resource allocation in the presence of negative externalities. You are familiar with this. You remember the demand-supply diagram. You remember that when we are talking about allocative efficiency in microeconomics, we assume that the marginal value to society of a particular activity or product depends on people's marginal willingness to pay for it. And we represent that with a downward sloping demand curve for it. There are a variety of assumptions that lie behind this. One such assumption is that there is already a socially ideal distribution of income and wealth, so that one person's marginal willingness to pay for something is no more valuable or no less valuable to society than anyone else's. A second underlying assumption is that people are rational, consistent utility maximizers, so that you can treat their marginal willingness to pay for something as a measure of objective marginal utility to them. Another assumption when we talk about the demand supply diagram as a guide to the ideal allocation of resources is that the supply curve describes the marginal cost to society of producing the item or undertaking the activity concerned. Now, in order for that to be true, you don't just need this market to be perfectly competitive, consisting of profit maximizing, perfectly competitive firms who are price takers. You also need that to be true of every other market in the economy, and you need there to be full employment. Under those circumstances, if there are no positive or negative externalities, that perfectly competitive equilibrium gives you the ideal amount of output to produce in order to maximize social welfare. Lots of underlying assumptions there. Well, if all those things are true, except there's a negative externality associated with production and consumption in the form of the impact of this activity on climate change, then if we can identify precisely the marginal cost of each additional unit of this output or activity that society is going to have to bear as a result of it driving climate change now and in the future, then we should be able to identify an optimal tax. You remember the theory: in order to internalize the externality, to make the polluter pay, and to adjust for this negative externality and reach the efficient approach to allocating resources. Again, but in order to be able to do this, you need to be able to look into the future. You need to be able to identify exactly, based on that analysis, with an appropriate social discount rate, depending on how important you see the welfare of future generations, or indeed your own welfare in the years to come, is so that you can precisely identify the marginal cost of, let's say, an additional ton of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases that are going to be emitted, and you can incorporate that in your tax, or you can do basically the same thing by issuing the optimal level of permits and having a trading scheme to use the market to identify the optimal price of a ton of carbon. That's the sort of Nordhaus approach. That's the environmental economics approach. It is essentially a static approach to the problem, and it fits nicely in neoclassical economics and general equilibrium analysis, and all those tools which are beautiful in their mathematical architecture, but in my view are divorced from reality. Perfect markets optimize with market failures as something which can be fixed to deliver an optimal resource allocation, a cost-benefit framework for optimal allocation, or auctioning of pollution permits, or the setting of an optimal tax, letting the polluter pay, internalizing the externality. What tends to go along with that then is technological optimism. We will develop the technology to deal with the problem. We will be able to grow our economies forever. We just need to appropriately internalize this externality in order to create the right signals and incentives so that we can fix the problem. That's environmental economics and climate change. The ecological economics approach, the Steve Keen approach, the Philip Lawn approach. Phil wrote a great book. It's a very long book and very expensive one, but a great book a few years ago called Resolving the Climate Change Crisis, the Ecological Economics of Climate Change. Ecological economists are non-neoclassical. They're more likely to be feminist economists. I think Kate Raworth can be described as both a feminist economist and an ecological economist. A complexity economist, because in complexity theory, there are feedbacks, there are tipping points, there are discontinuities, just as there are in climate science. A post-Keynesian economist or a modern monetary theory economist like Steve Keen or Stephanie Kelton, or an institutional economist in background. they're multidisciplinary in outlook. They don't tend to, in my view, they don't tend to pick and choose which bit of climate science to draw on. They don't try to persuade or to influence or put pressure on climate scientists to stay quiet or to avoid being to avoid saying anything which might alarm anybody. Instead, I hope that what we say is, let's see what the climate scientists and the Earth system scientists and engineers have got to say, and let's not try and optimize, because we don't understand the climate system and the other ecological threats that we face well enough to do that. Instead, let's just ask these guys what they think is safe. And then let's go about trying to organize our economies in the future so that we live within the limits of what is safe. And when I mean safe, I mean what we don't want to do is start going past those tipping points that put us on a potentially uncontrollable path towards a hothouse Earth. The economy, as you'll know, many of you, because you're familiar with Kate Raworth, is a subsystem of the natural environment. The issue is, at least in part, a scale one, a macroeconomic one. The fact that we now live on, economically speaking, a full Earth rather than an empty Earth. The fact that human economic activity is of a scale now so that we can have an impact on the ecosystems we live within, and that we can and indeed are driving climate change. It's about much more than microeconomic resource allocation. When we think about these issues, we are beset with uncertainties, feedback effects, and non-linearities. We need to be very cautious. Market mechanisms like emissions trading systems might help, but they're just a tool. They're not the only tool we have, and we don't know enough to optimize. Massive future disruption and even the collapse of civilization is, I'm not saying a probability, but it is a non-zero possibility. We cannot assume technology will save us. That's the rather, you might say, more depressing, but I think more realistic, certainly not hopeless, story that you get from ecological economists and most climate scientists. Pioneers of ecological economics. Well, I won't spend very long on this. There were 4 early pioneers of ecological economics. One was Nicholas Georgescu Rodin, whose work you can look up for yourself if you like. It's about applying the first and second laws of thermodynamics to the impact of economic activity on our ecosystem, including on climate change. But I don't want to go into that. Another pioneer is E.F. Schumacher, whose work you might read one day. Although he died in the late 1970s, but he wrote a very influential book called Small is Beautiful. He's the guy that came up with the term intermediate technology. I mention E.F. Schumacher in part because I went to school with his son. He lived opposite our school. All I remember about him, because I was too little to know that he was an important economist, was that he kept chickens in his garden. That's all I can remember about him. They had 2 colleagues who I have put on the slides here. Kenneth Boulding. I have included Kenneth Boulding, who was once a very, very famous economist, because of a beautiful essay, which you can have a look at via our site, that he wrote in 1966 called The Economics of the Coming Spaceship Earth. It was about the idea that we were moving from a world where human activity was below the Earth's biocapacity to one where that was no longer the case anymore, moving from an empty Earth to a full Earth. When I use the word full, I'm not just talking about population, I'm talking about the impact of economic activity. So Kenneth Boulding wrote in the 1960s of a transition from the economics of an empty Earth to the economics of a full Earth. And he wrote some very important things there, some of which I think unconsciously echo some of the wisdom that you can get from interacting with First Nations communities, not just that have been around for thousands of years, not just in Australia, but around the world. And the meaning of that word community. We need to develop less of an individualistic approach to thinking about economics, more of a communitarian approach. And when we think about what we mean by community, it's not just a community with the people that we live around today. It's a community that stretches back into the past and forward into the future as well. In 1973, Kenneth Boulding said, I think in an appearance before either a congressional or Senate committee in the US, anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. The video that I just shared, one of Kate Raworth's TED Talks, a more recent one, dwells on this issue. I think it's worth taking a look at. If you haven't taken a look at it, it's almost Kate Raworth's answer to our first assignment. Herman Daly, who Phil Lorne and I got to interview last December for a video that we played at a conference in Adelaide in January, developed the notion of the steady state economy. Now, that doesn't necessarily imply GDP can't grow over time. It's about material throughput. It's about the use of renewable and non-renewable resources and the emission of wastes. And he developed 3 sustainability precepts while working for the World Bank. 1, do not emit wastes at above the absorptive capacity of the natural world. If you keep filling the earth up with plastics, if you keep filling the earth up with all sorts of waste, you're creating problems for yourself. And of course, we are emitting carbon dioxide, or let's say we are adding to natural emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases at a rate which the natural world cannot safely absorb at the moment, and we have been doing for a long time. We need to deal with that. Do not use renewables at a rate faster than they can be renewed. You could be talking here about the topsoil. You could be talking here about agricultural processes and their impact on soil fertility in the future, for example. You can also be talking about chopping down forests and using the wood. Do not use non-renewable resources faster than you can develop renewable alternatives for them. Well, that's obviously the case too. If you are using, I don't know, lithium in batteries as you try to shift towards an approach to generating electricity which doesn't involve significant carbon emissions, then you better not use up all the lithium or all the rare earths before you've got alternative ways of ensuring that the electricity supply is always available, even when the sun isn't out and the wind isn't blowing. Okay, now what to talk about here. On the left-hand side, there is a chart from the Global Footprint Network organization, which is an organization of scientists and engineers, which has attempted to look not just at climate change, but the other elements of the other ecological constraints on human economic activity, which we're going to come to when we get to Kate Raworth's donut model in a few slides' time, perhaps on Thursday as well, to identify for individual countries and for the world as a whole what our biocapacity is. In other words, the point where once we go past it, we're in a full earth rather than an empty earth. The point where once we go past it, we are not obeying Herman Daly's 3 sustainability precepts. And the Global Footprint Network group tell us that we reached this point as a civilization somewhere in the early 1970s. We didn't get to the point where we were liable to be triggering potentially dangerous climate change until the 1990s, but we're not just talking about climate change here. We're talking also about things like loss of natural habitat and collapse of biodiversity and a whole series of other issues too. Anyway, the Global Footprint Network will tell you that in order for our current levels of consumption activities and the technologies we use in order to produce those goods and services which we consume to be sustainable, we would in 2019 have needed 1.7 Earths. We are 70% beyond, they say, the biocapacity of the Earth at the moment in terms of human activities. This year, the good news is that that gets rounded down from 1.7 to 1.6 because of the global recession. But let's say 2019 is a more normal year than 2020. And let's say we've got an ecological deficit of 70%, according to these scientists, compared to living within Daly's sustainability precepts. If you want to think not about the however many there are now, 7.5 billion people on the planet, but if you want to think about Americans, then if everybody lived like an American, we'd need 5 Earths, these people tell us, not just 1.7. But we shouldn't get smug as Australians. If everybody consumed like Australians consumed, the scientists tell us we need 4 Earths. The Earth as a whole is living far beyond its biocapacity, but the responsibility for this rests heavily on the shoulders of those of us that live in the highest income countries, like the US and like Australia. It doesn't rest on the shoulders of people living in Chad or South Sudan. They're living within the world's biocapacity. We're living well beyond the world's biocapacity. Not that we want living standards over time to fall to a level where we are all forced back into poverty and a desperate struggle for survival in the future, but we want to find a way of having prospering societies where people's living standards are maintained and enhanced over time while living within our biocapacity. In order to do this, we must reduce what ecological economists like Phil Lawn call our impact, where impact is described by them using what they call the IPAT equation. The first letter here, P, stands for population. Now, you have to be careful how you discuss this, because, of course, the people that are doing the damage, at least as things stand at the moment, are the relatively small proportion of humanity that live in very high-income countries. Nevertheless, if we are looking at at the average person around the whole world, our ecological impact is the global population times world GDP per capita times a term here which relates to the impact of each unit of GDP on the natural world, T for technology here. Now, as far as the global population is concerned, since 1970, when we were, according to these scientists, not exceeding the biocapacity of the planet, the world population has just slightly more than doubled. Just by coincidence, global GDP per capita at constant prices has also slightly more than doubled. So if it is the case, as these scientists claim, that our impact on the natural environment has increased by 70%, well, you can, of course, just solve this equation to find out the value of T in 2019 compared to 1970, and it comes out at just below 0.4. What does that mean? It means that we have, in a sense, enjoyed a considerable amount of relative decoupling since 1970. We'll use the term decoupling later on in the week to refer to carbon emissions and climate change. We're using it more generally here, but the IPAT equation suggests that we have got much better at producing output. Of course, part of this is technological change genuinely. Part of it is also a shift around the world away from manufacturing and towards services. There's been a huge reduction in the damage that we cause to the environment for each dollar's worth of output that we produce. There has been relative decoupling, but that relative decoupling has been nowhere near enough for there also to be absolute decoupling. In other words, despite the relative decoupling, the impact that we are having on the natural environment as a species continues to rise, and it was at its highest ever level in 2019. And there's no reason to assume that once we get past the pandemic and the global economy starts to recover in terms of GDP rising again, that it won't continue to rise much further than it has already. Well, in the long run, this is unsustainable. In the long run, we cannot continue to live above the biocapacity of the planet that we live on. That's what these guys say. We have to bring back our impact on the environment back towards 1. It will help that the global population will not rise forever, and it's expected to rise maybe to 11 billion before it stabilizes. So P won't rise forever, but unfortunately T won't fall forever too, or at least there is a limit to the fall in T. You can never reduce T to 0. There'll always be some impact of our activities on the natural environment, which suggests, according to ecological economists like Herman Daly and Phil Lawn, that there must be some limit on the extent to which the global economy can grow over time. Or in other words, as Kenneth Boulding says, anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. So let's just couple of minutes. Let's just say a few words about Kate Raworth, and then we can come back to these issues and focus more in particular on climate change on Thursday. Kate Raworth says economics textbooks, especially first-year economics textbooks, have a lot to answer for. And the neoclassical frame that they put into everybody's head is a very powerful one and a very misleading one, because of course, well, we've all seen something like the circular flow diagram. Okay, we can add a government to it, we can add foreign trade to it, we could even add a financial system to it, but we know how the circular flow is supposed to work. Consumers spend with firms, firms pay wages and other factor incomes to households in return for the real supplies of goods and services and factors going in the other direction. That's basically the story that we tell in introductory macroeconomics classes. You sometimes see that diagram in the first chapter of an economics textbook. But as Kate points out, it's not really circular. Households are taking in natural resources and generating pollution. Of course they are, as are firms. We can't ignore our impact on the natural environment. Moreover, it's often unequal. The circular flow diagram abstracts from the fact that not all households are in the same position, and that if we want to have thriving rather than necessarily growing economies in the future, we need to address social inequality not only within nations but also internationally, much more so than we do at the moment. And we're almost being primed to ignore it in those first year classes. And finally, what about unmonetized labor? What about the unpaid care economy? In many countries, were you to value unpaid output, if you want to use the word unpaid, largely provided by women in households as part of GDP, it would more than double gross domestic product, and yet we largely ignore, and in first year courses we do ignore, not only the unpaid care economy, but also what Kate calls the commons, all those ways in which we provide services, in which we do things for free for other people in our communities. So we need to change those textbooks, says Kate Raworth. We need to reflect the fact that we're in a full world, that the economy, it doesn't just include markets and the state and financial flows. It includes, when we're thinking about social provisioning, it includes what we do for each other in our household. It also includes the commons. She often talks about Wikipedia as a great example of something provided within the digital commons for free for people. But the economy is only part of the story. It sits within the society which it serves, which consists, of course, of the people who are members of that society. And our societies fit within our ecosystem. They draw living matter and materials and energy from the ecosystem. They generate waste heat and waste matter, which the ecosystem has to process, has to absorb. We think back to Herman Daly and his principles of sustainability there. And our ecosystem is more or less a closed system. More or less the only thing coming into it from outside is solar energy. And some of that solar energy which comes into our planet, which makes life possible, which powers our economy, some of it escapes. Otherwise, we'd end up living in Venus. Some of it escapes back out into the outside the Earth again. And if there wasn't a balance between, and if we lose the balance between solar energy coming in and the heat escaping our system, well, that's where we're trapped in a warming world with the threat of potentially catastrophic climate change. So Kate Raworth says we need to think like a 21st century economist, and this is where Kate and Stephanie and Mariana's work overlaps. We're going to talk about this a little bit on Thursday. We're going to talk about the donut. I've just mentioned her diagram for the embedded economy. We've been talking in this course about people being not rational economic man, not hyper-individualistic creatures, but we are naturally social creatures. We can adapt. We are influenced by other people, and in turn, we influence other people over time. We need to start taking into account complexity and feedback effects and move away, particularly when thinking about things like climate change, from the mechanical equilibrium models which William Nordhaus is carrying around in his head. We need to move away from thinking about Kuznets curves, either about income distribution or when we are talking about our impact on the ecosystem. And we'll talk a little bit about distributed by design and regenerative by design, which Kate talks about in Donut Economics on Thursday. And we'll also talk about being agnostic about growth. If you live within the sustainability precepts that Herman Daly outlined, then it doesn't matter whether the economy grows, whether GDP grows or not. You won't be destroying the environment within which you live. If you design your economy to thrive, whether or not GDP is growing, it doesn't necessarily matter what happens to the GDP statistic over time when we're thinking about the quality of people's lives. So we're not saying gross domestic product necessarily has to stop growing. We're agnostic about it, and we want to design economies where, although you continue to measure GDP, whether gross domestic product rises or falls over time doesn't have such a big impact on the quality of people's lives. And that's where we'll leave it, just before we go on and start thinking about the donut and some more stuff about climate change and about the potential for us to decouple our impact on the climate from gross domestic product, and a few other issues that we'll want to talk about as well. Okay, let me stop sharing because I've gone on too long, 5 minutes too long, and let's have a look at the chat. We don't have any chat. Okay, nobody's asked me anything. let me encourage you not to listen to me unless you enjoy it, but to obviously take a look at the slides, because I might ask you about stuff from that in our third quiz and in the final exam. But let me encourage you to look up Kevin Anderson, famous climate change scientist, Will Steffen, Earth system scientist, Johan Rockström, Kate Raworth, Phil Lawn, even. I might share a video of his towards the end of our course together. Bob Costanza at ANU. Look these guys up, and Kate Raworth as well, obviously, and listen to what they've got to say, form your own opinions, do some research, do some reading. You don't have to agree with me, but you have to think about this issue, because potentially this issue is the most important issue that human beings have ever faced in the entire history of our species, going back over hundreds of thousands of years. And we're dealing with something with the potential to impact not only your lives, but the lives of any people you leave behind after you leave this planet. So I'm not an expert. I'm not telling you what to think, but I'm asking you to think and to make your own mind up, and try and do it not based on any preconceptions you might have had. This shouldn't be a left-right issue. It shouldn't be a conservative socialist issue. It should be, at least when we're thinking about climate change, not necessarily when we're thinking about the future economy we want to build, but it should be something which is a scientific issue. Either these things are right or they're wrong. If people like Will Steffen are right, we better get a move on and deal with it. And there are no signs in Australia of us doing this at the moment. There will not be a massive investment in renewables announced in the budget today. That's not on the horizon. There will be at most a small nod in that direction. And it's up to us to change these things if we want to change them. All right, thanks very much. That'll do for the moment.